The Aurora Grand was one of the most prestigious restaurants in New York City, a place where the wealthy gathered to enjoy fine dining and live music. Amid the elegant chandeliers and soft jets floating through the air, Lena moved swiftly between tables, balancing trays with quiet grace. To most, she was just another waitress, but deep inside, she carried a passion that had never faded. The violin. Since childhood, music had been her sanctuary. She once dreamed of performing on grand stages, of hearing an audience hold their breath as she played. But life had taken a different course. Financial struggles forced her to put her dreams on hold, and now she worked long shifts to support herself and her younger brother. Yet, every time she passed the grand piano in the restaurant's corner, or watched the live musicians perform, a quiet longing stirred within her. That evening, a group of well-dressed patrons entered, led by Richard Cole, a successful but arrogant venture capitalist. He was known for his sharp tongue, his love of spectacle, and the way he enjoyed making others feel small. As he took his seat, his eyes scanned the restaurant and landed on Lena. Something about her piqued his interest, perhaps the quiet determination in her posture, or maybe he was simply looking for someone to entertain him. When she approached his table to take their orders, Richard leaned back, swirling his whiskey lazuli in his glass. His voice carried across the room, making sure everyone nearby could hear him. "Tell me, Lena, what do you do when you're not serving tables? Surely, a young woman like you had bigger dreams once." Lena hesitated for just a second before answering calmly, "I used to play the violin." Richard raised an eyebrow, a smirk curling at the corners of his lips. "A violinist? How interesting." He exchanged amused glances with his companions before turning back to her. "Why don't you play for us, then? Let's see if you were really any good." Lena stiffened. She hadn't played in front of an audience in years, and the idea of performing under the scrutinizing gaze of a man like Richard, who clearly saw this as nothing more than a game, made her stomach tighten. "I'm just here to work tonight," she replied, hoping that would be the end of it. But Richard chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, come on. There's a violin right there with the restaurant's live band. What's the harm in playing just one piece?" Or, he let his words linger before adding, "Have you forgotten how to play?" Laughter rippled through his table. Other diners turned their heads, curiosity flickering in their expressions. The challenge was clear play, or be dismissed as a fraud. A part of Lena wanted to walk away, to refuse and continue her shift. But then she heard a voice in her mind, her mother's voice. "Never let anyone make you feel small, Lena. You are more than they will ever know." Taking a slow breath, she lifted her chin and looked Richard straight in the eye. "Fine," she said, her voice steady. "I'll play." The restaurant fell silent as Lena walked toward the small stage where the live band performed. A violin rested on its stand, untouched for the moment. She reached for it, feeling the familiar weight settle in her hands. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the flood of emotions rushing through her. Richard leaned back in his chair, smirking. He had seen this before, people who thought they had talent, only to embarrass themselves in front of an audience. His companions watched with thinly veiled amusement, expecting a mediocre performance at best. Lena took a deep breath and closed her eyes. The restaurant, the staring faces, even Richard's smug expression, everything faded. And then, she played. The first note rang out, soft and delicate, like a whisper in a quiet room. But as the melody unfolded, her confidence grew. She chose a piece that spoke of longing, resilience, meditation, from *Ties* by Massenet. The sound rose and fell with haunting beauty, each note carrying a piece of her story, the sacrifices, the lost dreams, the fire inside her that had never truly died. A hush settled over the room. Conversations halted. Silverware was set down. Even the restaurant staff, who had been moving between tables, stopped in their tracks. Richard, who had been watching with amused detachment, sat up straighter. His smirk faded. He hadn't expected this. He had expected something timid, uncertain, not a performance that commanded the entire room. Lena's bow glided across the strings with effortless grace. Each note swelled with raw emotion, weaving a melody that captivated, humbled, and silenced. Her music was more than just skill, it was honesty, defiance, and power. By the time she reached the final note, the restaurant was so still that she could hear her own breath. The last sound of the violin faded into silence, leaving a lingering echo in the air. And then applause. Not polite claps, but thunderous applause. It spread like wildfire across the room, some diners even rising to their feet. A few guests wiped away tears, visibly moved by what they had just witnessed. Lena slowly lowered the violin, her breath uneven, her heart pounding not from nerves, but from the realization that, for the first time in years, she had truly been seen. She glanced toward Richard's table. He sat motionless, his fingers laced together, his expression unreadable. The arrogance that had colored his face all evening had vanished. For the first time, he had no words. Part 3, the turning point. The applause roared on, filling every corner of the restaurant. Lena stood motionless for a moment, the weight of the moment settling in her chest. She had played many times before, but never like this, never with the feeling that her music had completely shifted the atmosphere of a room. Slowly, the clapping faded, but the energy lingered. Diners exchanged looks, whispering about the unexpected brilliance of the performance. The restaurant staff smiled at her with quiet pride. She had been just another waitress an hour ago, but now, she was something more. She turned her gaze toward Richard. He sat still, his jaw tight, his fingers tapping lightly on the edge of his glass. Gone was the smirk, the smugness, the air of superiority. He was exposed. He had wanted to put her on the spot, to control the moment, to remind everyone of the power he held. Instead, he had been silenced. Clearing his throat, he reached for his drink and forced a small chuckle. Well, that was impressive. He paused, searching for the right words, trying to regain some of his presence. I suppose talent can come from unexpected places. His words rang hollow, and the people around him knew it. His companions, who had laughed along with him earlier, now sat uncomfortably, unsure whether to follow his lead or remain quiet. Lena didn't respond right away. Instead, she studied him, her expression calm, unreadable. Then, she spoke. Everyone has a gift, she said softly but firmly. It's how you choose to use it that matters. A beat of silence passed. The words hung in the air, heavier than they seemed. Richard shifted in his seat, visibly uncomfortable. He gave a slight nod, then turned to signal the waiter for the check. For the first time that evening, he had nothing more to say. As Lena placed the violin back on its stand, several diners stopped her. An older woman touched her hand and whispered, "That was breathtaking, dear. Don't ever stop playing." A man in a crisp suit leaned forward and said, "You have something special. The world needs to hear it." But the most surprising moment came as she returned to the floor. A man approached her, someone who had been sitting quietly in the back of the restaurant. He reached into his pocket and handed her a business card. "I'm a music producer from Chicago," he said in a measured voice. "I don't make empty promises, but I know talent when I hear it. If you're serious about playing again, give me a call." Lena stared at the card, her breath catching in her throat. This wasn't a promise of fame or fortune, but it was a door, one she had long believed was closed. That night, as she walked home through the quiet streets, the city lights reflecting in the puddles on the pavement, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Certainly, she wasn't just a waitress. She wasn't just a forgotten dreamer. She was a violinist, and no amount of arrogance, no cruel laughter, no past hardship could ever take that away from her. Her journey wasn't over. In fact, it had only just begun.